Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating piece of legal history that plays out quite literally like a realistic courtroom drama. We're looking at the landmark case of Miss Gray v. Cathcart. If you've ever wondered about the strict boundaries of marital finances, or, the fine lines of contract law, you are definitely in the right place. Let's see exactly what happens when a high-end shopping trip turns into a bitter legal battle.
Let me hook you right from the start with the central question here. Is a husband automatically liable for his wife's expensive debts? Imagine the scenario. One spouse racks up this massive bill and just tells the shop owner, hey, forward the invoice to my partner. Does the law actually force the husband to open his wallet? Well, as you'll see, the answer isn't quite as simple as you might think.
Okay, let's dive into this. Part 1. The Elegant Boutique Purchase.
Our story begins in a very elegant boutique. Mrs. Cathcart walks into this beautiful shop, browses the latest styles, and selects several really expensive outfits from the shop owner, Miss Gray. And this wasn't just a minor purchase either. Miss Gray supplied her with high fashion worth a significant £215. Back then, that was a major sum, and it immediately set the stakes for the conflict that was about to unfold.
Which brings us to Part 2, the unpaid clothing bill.
Right, so here is where the transaction takes a critical turn. Mrs. Cathcart didn't actually pay at the register. Instead, she bought the items entirely on credit, promising the tradesman that her husband would settle the bill later. But when Mr. Cathcart receives that £215 invoice, he outright refuses to pay it. So left entirely out of pocket for her expensive merchandise, Miss Gray does what any business owner would do. She files a lawsuit against the husband to recover her money.
Moving on to Part 3, the courtroom evidence.
Now we're in the courtroom. Miss Gray argued that the husband was obviously responsible for purchases made on his credit. But Mr. Cathcart brought a pretty explosive piece of counter-evidence to the judge. He proved that he was already providing his wife with a highly generous annual allowance of £960. And this wasn't just general household money. It was specifically for her to manage her own clothing and personal expenses.
This £960 allowance is absolutely crucial because it introduces a vital legal concept, implied authority or agency by necessity. Essentially, this is the legal presumption that a spouse might have the authority to buy necessities on their partner's credit. However, and this is a big however, the defense argued that this implied authority is completely voided if an adequate financial allowance has already been provided.
And this brilliantly illustrates Part 4, the final legal verdict.
So, the judge had to weigh that £215 debt against the £960 annual allowance. And the court established a crystal clear precedent here. A sufficient allowance equals no implied authority to buy on the husband's credit. Because that £960 was entirely adequate for her personal needs, the judge ruled Mrs. Cathcart had absolutely no legal authority to pledge his credit at the boutique.
Which leads us to the definitive verdict of Miss Gray v. Cathcart. Despite the wife's £215 debt to the tradesman, the husband is not liable. No way! The court held firmly that a husband simply cannot be forced to pay his wife's debts if he already gives her a sufficient allowance to buy her own clothes.
It's a really fascinating conclusion, isn't it? It completely forces us to rethink financial boundaries. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative question to think about. How does this historical legal precedent on implied authority continue to shape the way we view modern financial relationships today? Next time you think about shared credit, remember the elegant boutique, that $960 allowance, and Mr. Cathcart's successful defense. Thanks so much for learning with me today.